Hello, everybody. I'm glad everybody came in on one of these hot days, except compared to what we've had, it actually seems fairly glacial today. Today we have Lee Dumond, yeah, I'm butchering again, Dumond, and he's going to talk about Web API. Sorry about that. Um, I was asking him some questions before we got started, and I know he's from Decatur and some things, but he has a history that's a little different. If you don't know, I started out as a musician. Well, guess what? He was off in Maine many years ago, and he was a studio engineer and a producer. Portland, Maine. Can you imagine that? That's how he started. And from there, he went to Decatur. Go figure. Um, he started out in music, but if you think about it, music has a lot of technical aspects, as some of the recording people around here can understand. Doing things like audio, some websites, audio, you get involved in the codecs, and that can be pretty nasty at times. And from there, he started doing some programming, and if you figure out the dates and things, maybe about 85, he started doing VB6 and some ASP, and don't know if it was right in that time, but he started programming. He's done Ruby, he's done Python, he does like Microsoft tools, C Sharp obviously, probably some basic. He likes web types of applications, and then in 2003, he moved to Decatur for various reasons. And has been doing primarily freelancing since he's moved into this area, which is a non-traditional kind of job habit compared to everybody else. So today he talks about something he knows quite a bit about, which is basically web applications and then how the web API fits within ASP.NET. So I'm excited about it, not sure exactly what it's going to be, but I think it'll be entertaining. So here's Lee.
All right, thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Who am I kidding? We don't have any ladies here, do we? Okay. My name is Lee Dumond, despite what you may have heard recently. And thank you very much for asking me to speak about the ASP.NET Web API. First, a little bit about me. Oh, geez, okay, I thought I took that out. A little bit about me. All right, okay. Okay, a little bit about me. I have written a couple of books, probably nothing you'd be terribly interested in, but they are available wherever fine books are sold. Just go to Amazon, search for Lee Dumond. Something should come up. As Mark mentioned, I am a freelancer. You can hire me. In fact, my current contract is ending this week. If you know of anything, please keep me in mind. I will work for food. I will work for tips. I will clean your pool. If you give me enough beer, I will fill your pool. You can find me, pretty much Lee Dumond, everywhere, as you can see right down here. Unfortunately, I have recently discovered that I am not the only Lee Dumond on the internet. If you happen to Google me and come across this picture, please keep in mind that I am no longer actively participating in the bodybuilding world. A few disclaimers before we start. These are things I usually like to get out of the way as quickly as possible. First of all, I may not be very good with computers. There will be some code samples. It's possible some of them may not work. If they fail, now you know why. Second, ASP.NET 4 is still beta software. You should observe all the normal precautions that you would normally take when installing and utilizing beta software. Anything I'm about to show you could be changed by Microsoft at any time, for any reason or for no reason. And finally, the presentation may contain some jokes. I cannot guarantee they will all be funny. I love APIs. I love, love, love APIs. In fact, I love APIs so much that I started a podcast about APIs. In fact, it is still the world's only podcast dedicated solely to APIs, mashups, and the web as a platform. It is available on iTunes. There's a website, mashthis.io. .io, get it? .io, .io. Okay, I can see most of you don't get it. All right. One of the reasons I really like APIs is that APIs can get you laid. It worked for this guy. I guarantee it can work for you. APIs can get you paid. These two gentlemen started an API-based company called Instagram. And 2 years later, the two guys in this slide sold that company 2 years later to the guy in this slide for $1 billion. But the real reason I like APIs is, as Mark mentioned, I work mostly on the web. And I like to expose myself to as many people as possible. Okay, that did not come out right at all. What I meant to say is I like to expose my data to as many clients as possible. Now, not just desktop browsers and mobile browsers. If you build websites, that's what you're dealing with. But native mobile applications, smartphones, home-connected devices, cars, microwaves, refrigerators, electric toothbrushes, and even other APIs, right? That's what a mashup is, right? So, APIs are great. What is ASP.NET Web API all about? Well, first of all, it's a framework for building HTTP services on top of the .NET framework. It ships with ASP.NET 4, but interestingly enough, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, it is not dependent on the ASP.NET runtime. You can run Web API as part of a web application. You can run it completely outside of a web application. You can run it, I'll jump down to here, you can run it on IIS, you can run it on Azure, you can run it on a computer with no server at all. There's an Owen adapter available, so you can run it on Apache. It's simple. It embraces HTTP as an application level protocol. Well, what does that mean? We'll talk about what that means in a second. It's flexible. It provides interoperability via content negotiation. We talked in the slide previously about being able to reach all different clients. If something is connected to the web, whether it's your browser, whether it's your phone, whether it's anything, it speaks a language called HTTP. HTTP has a protocol, a specification that ASP.NET Web API embraces, that it works with, and we'll talk about that. And it uses content negotiation to be able to provide data to clients in the format that they desire or the format that they require. It's scalable. It includes a fully asynchronous task-based service framework called HttpClient. About a month ago, Alan asked me on Twitter about something called ResSharp. And ResSharp is a library that was written by a friend of mine, John Sheehan, and HttpClient is actually Microsoft's version of that. And I'll demonstrate that a little later on. How is ASP.NET Web API different from MVC? Well, as you start working with it, at least on the outside, it will appear very similar to MVC. And that's not by accident. The developers at Microsoft wanted people to be able to leverage their MVC experience. and you'll find that you'll be able to do that. But internally, it works very differently. There are different tools. MVC is very good at taking in form data and spitting out HTML. API is very good at taking in raw requests and spitting out structured data. If you have a smartphone and you're on a cellular data plan with a data cap, and you're running a native application that hooks to an API, would you rather download 50K of HTML or 50 bytes of JSON? That's a no-brainer, right? Right? So, how do I get all this awesome sauce? Well, you go to asp.net/web-API. There's a big green button. Click that. It'll take you to a number of download options, one of which is the web platform installer. I am happy to report that nearly all of the suck has been removed from the web platform installer. So it's a pretty good experience. And in fact, I've done that on this very computer. And let me show you how that works. Oh, I didn't have Visual Studio running. Okay. New project. We see we have MVC for web application, desktop, that sounds good. Web API is one of the new project templates. We'll grab that. And we'll wait for Visual Studio to do its magic juju. And this looks very much like the new project experience in MVC, of course. But we have this thing called if we look in the controllers folder, we have this thing called a values controller. Hold on just a second here. We have this thing called a values controller. We all remember what the home controller looks like, right? Pretty familiar. And that inherits from system.web.nvc.controller. This values controller inherits from API controller, and that lives in system.web.http.api controller. So there is no dependence on MVC. All of the API, web API DLLs live in a completely separate namespace, completely decoupled from ASP.NET itself. So let's go ahead and fire this up and see what happens. Okay, we get this. We've all seen this before, right? Okay, so let's access our values controller, which is an API controller, and see what happens. Okay, it's not trying to open a page, but it is trying to open a file. And it's a 19-byte file, so let's go ahead and see what it is. Open that, open that. Value 1, value 2. Take a look at this values controller. There's a get method. It returns an array of strings, value 1, value 2. There's another get method that takes an ID and returns a single string called value. So let's go ahead and try that. Okay, now it's trying to open up another file. Let's go ahead and open that. Open that, open that. There it is, okay? Not very exciting, obviously. So I've taken the liberty of writing let's go ahead and close this, a little sample application. This is a little contact manager application. Why is it not? Okay. This is a little contact manager application. And the only thing different that I've done so far from the default application that we get is I've deleted the values controller, and I've added a API controller called Contacts Controller. And what I'm doing here is I'm instantiating the controller, and I have sample data hardwired directly into the controller, the way all real men do it, right? Okay, and so you can see my sample data. And this is like a little contact manager application. So I have a list of contacts and their email addresses and their phone numbers. And I have 3 get methods. I have get contacts, I have get contact by ID, and I have get contacts by email domain. So when I do get contacts, that just returns my hard-coded list of contacts, right? When I do get contact, well, let me jump down to here. When I do get contacts by email domain, it just gives me a list of the contacts that contain the domain in their email address. And when I do a get contacts by ID, I find the one that has the ID and return it, except if I can't find it, then what do? What would I do if it was MVC? What would I do? I'd probably return like an HTTP not found, right? Well, you don't do that here. What you do is return an HTTP response exception and with a status code of not found, which is 404, right? And instead of, let's go ahead and fire this up. Instead of using Notepad and all that stuff to access this, let's go ahead and, this is a tool called Fiddler. Anybody familiar with Fiddler? Everybody's familiar with Fiddler, right, I hope, okay? If you work on the web, you really can't get away from it. So let's do a, no, that's not going to work. If I could see better, I could type better, okay. All right. Okay. There's my list of contacts, and I see it's in JSON. There's my raw response right there. Now you notice something. I never serialized this in the JSON on the server side at all, did I? Did you see me do that? How does that happen? Well, we'll get to that in a second. Let's try contacts 4. All right. That's my 4th contact, my contact with an ID of 4, that's Jose. Okay, let's try doing a search by domain. So we'll do a comma, domain, equals gmail.com. Hold on just a second here. All right. Sorry. And we get back, let's see, we get back Mark, we get back Andrew, we get back Lee. So those 3, okay? And that's essentially how the web API works. You'll notice that all of these were GET requests, okay? Whenever you issue a request in HTTP, it's always associated with a verb, and there are several verbs, get, and you'll see all this whole list. Now, the most important ones are get, post, put, and delete, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But what I'd like to show you is hold on a second. I'd like to talk about content negotiation, because we talked about that's how it provides operability, okay? Now, more and more clients that consume APIs want JSON, because it's the lightest weight data format on the wire. And data plans are expensive, and they're capped now. But let's just say you have a legacy client that requires XML, okay? Well, JSON and XML are both supported out of the box with Web API. You don't have to do anything. And you can return your data as either JSON or XML, okay? And you can add support for any other format that you can write a serializer for by adding a custom class that inherits from media type formatter. Say, for example, we wanted to return some kind of a format that we could paste into Excel, right? That would be comma separated value. So we could write a serializer that returns as text CSV. And I actually did that. If I have time, I'll show you. But let me go back to the application here and show you how content negotiation works. Now you notice that all of these returned JSON. Why? Because that's the default format, okay? This is the formatted. It's kind of nice. Fiddler gives you a little formatted display if you want. If I wanted something different, I could specify this out of curiosity. Does anybody know what I do to get XML? Pretty close. Yeah, there you go, right? This time I got back XML. What happens if I specify a content type, an accept header that isn't supported at all? Anybody guess? Right. Why? That's the default, right? Okay, good, good. Now, we've issued all these requests, but one thing we haven't talked about at all is how does the framework know how to route which request to which controller and which action inside that controller? Okay, well, let me show you. First, we're going to open the routing table. Does anybody know where that is? Ah, nope. They moved all that stuff. Trick question. Yeah, I used to live in global ASAX, but the problem is that if you've done any MVC, you probably have noticed that the application start method was getting like this long. What? In concept of various? Sure, yeah. Anyway, so as I was saying, so they moved all this stuff to this app start folder. And this is the routing table. Now you'll notice the map route method, and this is the routing rule for, the default routing rule for MVC, right? Pretty familiar. Take a look up here. Looks very similar. It's called a map HTTP route. And there's one important thing that's different. You'll notice here there's a placeholder for controller, there's one for action, and there's one for ID. Up here, there's a literal section called API / and then there's a placeholder for controller, and then there's the optional ID, but there's no action. MVC works by matching the action name to the name of the method. So how does API work? What does it use for the action? It uses the HTTP method, right? Remember I showed you that list of HTTP methods? Okay, and let me show you again here. Hold on a second. We have three actions, okay? We have get contact by ID, and get contacts by email domain. What do they all have in common? They start with the word get, right? And that's no accident. What happens is, and this is the way that the routing table matches the incoming request with the action. It matches the parameters by looking at the URL and the query string, just like MVC. And it matches the controller by looking at the URL. But it doesn't match the action that way. It matches the action by looking at the HTTP method. And then if it's a get, it goes to the controller and it rounds up the entire list of public actions, public methods that start with the word get. So it knows it's one of those three in this case. And then it starts to narrow it down by looking at the URI. So if there's a get API/contacts and it's a get request and there's nothing else on the URL, it knows that this is it because it doesn't take any parameters. If there's an ID on in the URL, it uses this one. If there's something on the query string, it tries to match that. So it uses this one. Now, the fact is that it doesn't matter what the it doesn't matter what the name of the method is at all, just as long as it starts with the word get. Okay? Now, these are all conventions that are wired in that can be overridden. If you have a legacy controller that you need to, for some reason, need to honor the names, or if you have a different naming convention in your shop, you can override all this. How we use HTTP methods is important. And as I mentioned, there are four main ones: get, post, put, and delete. Get gets things. Retrieves a representation of the resource at a specified URI. How does it know which representation to retrieve? How does it know? How does it know? How does it know? Content negotiation, right? Okay. Nobody's been paying attention. Thank you very much. Okay. I'll stay. And post, and there are actually rules for this that are specified by the HTTP specification. Post creates a new resource, and the convention is to return not a 200, but a 201, which is a special status code for created. And a couple of other things too. It should return the entire new entity that was created on the server back to the client. And it does that by filling the response payload with a serialized entity. And then it includes the URI of the new resource in the location header. Put updates a resource at a specified URI, and that returns 200. Delete, of course, deletes. And, you know, there's not a really strong convention about which status code to return. You can return 200. I tend to like 204, which is no content. You can return 201, I think, which is accepted. Especially if it's a multi-threading application and it doesn't delete right away, but it's in the process of deleting and returns early, you can return accepted. So it knows that it's working on it, but maybe hasn't finished yet. So I want to actually, at this point, close this and open up another one that wrote. And this is very similar to the last one we just saw, except it has more methods. Has methods to, has our get contacts, it has our get contacts by ID, has our get contacts by email domain, and of course it has our post contact, put contact, delete contact. And I abstracted the data away in this little repository to make Mark Levick happy. And so let's go ahead and fire this up. Oh, that is not what I wanted to do. Let's start this one first. Okay, let's go ahead and fire that up. Ba, 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 ba. All right. Oh, what I want to show you first is I've explained these three methods already. Take a look at the post method. First, it checks the validity of the model state, right? It takes a whole CLR. Now, obviously, the client is not sending us a CLR, okay? But what happens is it deserializes in the background. And of course, we already mentioned that there's serialization and deserialization support for JSON and XML. So it uses in the background a library called JSON.net, which is actually a third-party library. It wasn't invented by Microsoft, but they kind of took it over. And, well, they didn't actually take it over. They just are using it. And so it uses that to deserialize the request payload into a contact. And then it checks the model state. It adds, returns the new contact. Likely it's obviously going to be exactly the same as a contact that was sent in, except that now it's going to have an ID, right? We're not going to send an ID to the client. We're going to let the repository create the ID, and then we're going to get that back. And you'll see how this follows the rules that we talked about in that slide. First of all, it doesn't just return the contact. It returns a response message. And this create response method does two things. It first lets you set the status code, which I've got here is 201 created. And it lets you stuff entity into the response payload. And then when it sends back out, it'll serialize. And then you have this little URL. This is a new helper method on the URL helper class. And you just give it a root name and values, and that will give you a link based on the name of the route in your routing table. So it was called default API, if you remember that. Right there, okay? So anyway, and it adds it to the location. As a location header, there's a headers collection, and it adds it to the location header of the headers collection. And then it returns. Put returns nothing, so that's going to send back as a 200. And delete, it removes it from the repository, and then it sends back, in this case, a 204. We could have had void instead of returning an HTTP response message, or we'll just return 200, and that would have been fine probably too. And let me kind of show you how this works real quickly. Let's get one of these contacts again. Okay. All right, so this is Jose. Now let's go ahead and delete Jose. The URI is going to be exactly the same, except we're going to change the HTTP verb. And see what we got back? 204. 204, no content. And let's go back and oh, because it's a delete. Got to go back to get, sorry. And we'll look, we'll see we've got Alan is 1, Mark is 2, Andrew is 3, Lee is 5, 4 is gone. All right? So let's see if we can add him back. Okay, I'm going to cheat here for a second. I'm going to grab the raw data from here. And let's go ahead and create a post request. And we'll paste that into the request payload. We're not going to specify an ID, obviously, because that will be assigned on the server side. And let's put a content type in there. Oops. Application. All right, and let's go ahead and execute. What? Sorry. Thank you. Okay. So we got back our 201. All right. We got back our entity that was created, but now has an ID of 6, right? That was the next ID that was available. And we got back our location header, which is right there. So if we do a of course, no, it doesn't want that. If we do a get for that, we should get back Jose again. If we do a get for 4, I think that's what it was before, not found. Okay, so time is it? How much time do I have? Not too bad. Okay, so we've discovered a few ways that we can issue requests, right? We saw you could do it through the browser. We saw that you could do it with Fiddler. What are some other cool ways that we can send requests to an API? That is a cool way. You know what? I'm going to show you how to do it. I am going to show you how to do it. But how about if you have a, I don't know, let's see. Hold on a second. jQuery. Did someone say jQuery? I think I heard someone say jQuery. Okay, great. Let's take a look at what's going on here. Take a look at this page. What do you notice about this page? Plain HTML, right? No razor view here, no passing in a model, nothing up my sleeve, nothing up my sleeve. And this is plain HTML5. And what happens is when the page first loads, we get a list of all the contacts, right? What's that going to do? Oh, not found, because we deleted that one before, but he's back now at number 6. Let's see. It's got all the ones that are Gmail. Okay. This is all done through plain vanilla JavaScript and HTML. What happens is when the page first loads, it does the getJSON method. And interestingly enough, the getJSON method sends a GET request with a accept header of JSON. So, and it issues it to API/contacts. If we want to get a contact by ID, remember we have a text box for that, so it gets the contact ID from the text box and does the exact same thing. If we want to get our contacts by email domain, it gets the domain from the text box. It issues a JSON request to the appropriate URI and does the same thing. Displays it on the screen. We can, let's see here. I think I'm pretty sure I stuck this in here. How about posting? How about posting? Let's try doing some posting. I think I might have done this. Let's do Keith, Reichert, and let's do Keith Reichert at lrs.com, and let's see, 217-555-1212. Oh, that sounds like a fake phone number there, buddy. Really, it does. Okay. So let's go ahead and create contact. Look what we got back. That is the URI from our location header. Let's just take a look at that real quick. Here's our create contacts form. Okay, not a razor view, no model being passed in, plain vanilla, nothing up my sleeve, nothing up my sleeve. And again, all we have is a plain vanilla form. In fact, it's not an AJAX form or it doesn't use a helper method. We can if we're using just plain HTML. And it specifies a method of post. It has the action that is the URL that we need to use for an action and an ENC type of application form URL encoded. I should have mentioned before that for posting, form URL encoded is also implemented out of the box in Web API. And so what it does is you'll notice it jumped right back. It didn't do a full post back, right? So when I hit the submit button, the final line is return false. Or I could have put an event here and, event prevent default, right? This probably would have been the preferable way to go. But what it does is it, first of all, intercepts the form so it's never actually submitted back to the server. All it does is it sends back a request payload to the server with the serialized form values. And then once it returns, it gets the response header with the name of location from the response, and it sends it up to the screen. I wonder if I had, probably didn't have it running. Let's try it again. Oh, now it added again to 8. So let's see what happened. So we see, I want to look at the, this is what I want to look at. This is the raw request, and you'll see right down here, name and email equals and phone equals. That's how URL encoded form values are posted, right? So it included that in the request payload. So anyway, couple of things before we now, Mark said, what about Windows Forms? Can we call an API, an HTTP API through Windows Forms? And the fact is, yes, we can. In fact, we can call our API from Windows Forms, from WPF, from Metro app, from a console app even, using HttpClient. All the methods are asynchronous. We talked about REST-Sharp a little earlier, and REST-Sharp has both synchronous and asynchronous methods. In HttpClient, all the methods are asynchronous. And that's really the way that Microsoft is going now with everything, with IIS 8 and everything. It's going to be all asynchronous, and if you have to use something synchronous, you'll have to wrap it. So those methods return tasks of T, and so in other words, when you make a call, like say issue a GET request and you're getting 10,000 contacts back, well, you don't have to block the UI thread while you're waiting for all those contacts to come back, right? The user can continue to work while they download, and then it issues a callback, and then it can display or do whatever it has to do. And in fact, I'll demonstrate that real quick. Let's see. Up here I have a console application. Right, let's see. Oh, of course, there has to be one guy with a long name to screw up my formatting up here, but anyway. So I've just, what am I gonna do, right? So, so I've gotten back my list of contacts from a console application. Let's take a look at how we did that. Now, in a console application, do we have ASP.NET runtime available? No, right? And in fact, all I did here was instantiate a new HTTP client with a base address of the address that the fixed address that my local host application is running on. And then I added a default request accept header of application JSON. I didn't really need to do that. If I wanted XML, I would have had to do that. But I just wanted to show you that it could be done. I issued a GET request. Now this says GET async, right? So it's asynchronous. Now in this case, probably none of you are noticing this, so I probably shouldn't say anything. I bet Andrew might be noticing it, that this isn't really asynchronous, right? Right, okay, so I probably should explain that. The call is asynchronous, but there's no multi-threading code in here, okay? And the reason that is because there's no real threading context in a console application. I probably would have had to do like a WPF application to really show how that would work, and I didn't want to make it too complicated, but what I'm doing here is I'm issuing an asynchronous request, but then I'm calling the result property on it. And when I do that, it does block. So once I get the result, if response is success status code, that means if it's in the range of 200 to 299, it reads and serializes into a numeral list of I should say deserializes into a enumerable list of contacts, and then it just goes through and writes them to the console. Pretty simple. Pretty simple. Let's see, about 10 minutes of 8. A couple of things I wouldn't mind showing you. I stuffed a couple of extra Easter eggs in here in case we had time, and so why not? Let's see. We mentioned before, right, that serializing and deserializing out of the box with JSON and XML are supported. But let's just say, for example, we mentioned before, say we wanted to paste the output into Excel, and we really need that CSV. And we showed when we did that the first time that we didn't get CSV back. Obviously, we just got JSON back because our API said, wow, what is this text/CSV? I have no idea what that is, and just threw it away. But the thing is, any format that you can write a serializer for, you can add to your web API. And I wrote one for CSV, so let's take a look at that real quick. All right. When you create a formatter, you have to inherit it from either media type formatter or buffered media type formatter. And the reason that I did buffered media type formatter is because it's single thread, and I didn't install .NET 4.5 here. If I had, I would have been able to use async and await, and otherwise I didn't feel like writing the multi-threading code to do that. So to do it in .NET 4. So this is just a single threading formatter. But what you've got to do is you've got to override a couple of methods that are inherited from the media type formatter. And one is can write type, and one is can read type. Okay, writing is serializing, right? We want to be able to write comma-separated values back to the client. So we definitely want to implement that. Can read type, that means can the client post comma-separated values back to us? And we don't care about that. So I'm just going to return false. And then you override write to stream. And if I was implementing deserialization, I would obviously have to override read from stream, right? And all I'm doing here is I'm checking the the type of the object. And what I did up here is I let the class know that I can serialize either a contact or a list of contacts. So that's what I check. I check if it's a single contact or a list of contacts, and then I go down to this helper method that is write contact as CSV, and I do that in each case, whether it's a list of contacts or a single contact. And all that does is it takes my contact and the stream writer that I pass in, and it writes a comma-separated list of values to the line. So let's go ahead, and we've got this formatter, and let's go into global ASAX, and we can add it to the formatters collection of the configuration property of the global configuration object. This object right here, this static class global configuration, is pretty much the only static set of variables for Web API. Pretty much this is the only place they live. And so we've added that. And let's do a rebuild. And let's go ahead and do a get. I thought that was a get already. Okay. Obviously, it's JSON. Now, let's go ahead and do an accept. Accept text CSV, and see what we get back. Right there. There you go. Comma separated list of values. So we pulled that off. And like I showed you in the slide, if you wanted to do an API that, say, you could use to syndicate your blog, you could do RSS or Atom, or you could do a custom format. You could do vCard. That would be something kind of cool to do with a contact manager, right? So, so I'm going to wrap up here at this point. There's so many things that are remaining to learn. We've only really just scratched the surface. We have most of the extensibility points that are already live in MVC, like authorization filters, action filters, exception filters, complex model validation, custom serialization. I mentioned before that the serialization is uses the JSON.NET library, okay? But if for some reason you need to add some suck to your application, you can drop back to the data contract serializer from WCF. Or you can even go back to the older serializer, which is JavaScript serializer. Or if you write your own serializer and call it cornflake serializer, I don't know. You can add that in. So so you can do all kinds of customization that way. Of course, I mentioned we can override the routing conventions. built-in dependency injection with a version of control through iDependency Resolver. That's very handy if you want to unit test, and I definitely suggest that you do. You can use the built-in one, like I say, or you can drop in Ninject or whatever you happen to like. API Explorer. This is kind of added a little later in the game, just before the RC, in fact. It's a class that basically helps you write help documentation that you can that will export as HTML and go through all the public methods in your API controllers and basically specify which URLs. It uses it uses the default routing table, the routing table too, that's in the route config class, and it will basically write you like a little start, like a scaffolding, but like a little start help page for your API that you can publish to clients, human clients, I should say. I already mentioned hosting outside of ASP.NET. OData support. The OData support is kind of half-baked right now. We actually interviewed on the podcast, my podcast, we interviewed Brad Wilson, who's on the ASP.NET Web API team. And I specifically asked him about this. And it was a situation at that point where they had added it for the original beta, then they took it out, and then they kind of put it back in, but they don't have all the possible parameters implemented. You can do kind of rudimentary paging, but you know all the filtering is not really in place. I think eventually ASP.NET is open source now, so I think eventually they'll get enough contributions where they'll be able to make it work and work well. But of course, you know, you can still do paging and filtering and stuff by putting stuff on the query string, right? But if you really, really need to support OData, I probably would suggest going with WCF at this point. Goes great with Entity Framework. Here, I'll show you something real quick. Anybody here know what T4 is? Scaffolding, right? Okay. So when you add a controller, right? You know, if you add an MVC controller, you can scaffold it by and write all the CRUD methods for a particular CLR or POCO object by specifying the class and where your data context lives. And you can do exactly the same thing with an API controller. See, API controller with read-write actions using Entity Framework. So I can do that, and then I can just tell it what my model is as a contact. Then I can give it my data context class, which I don't have one. Otherwise, I would do it. But what will happen is it'll create a controller for you with all the posts and the puts and the gets and the deletes already in place. And it will add all the necessary stuff to your data context so that it will expose it as part of the repository. And so that's actually pretty cool too. So let's see. A couple of resources I wanted to point out. You can download it at asp.net/vnex/overview/downloads. Probably just go to the main part on the ASP.NET website that deals with Web API, which is /web-API, and you can get to all this stuff, including the release notes and, of course, the forums. The source code, this is probably the most interesting resource that's up here. ASP.NET-webstack.codeplex.com. You can download all the source code. You can even build it and run it and change it. And if you come up with a cool change, you can even send it back to them, and they might accept it. In fact, when I showed you that slide with about the podcast, I have a couple of co-hosts, and one of them is Nick Berardi. He happened to be the first person to have a pull request accepted for the ASP.NET open source. So he's kind of, that's his claim to fame. Plus he gets to work with me. I guess that's his second claim to fame. I don't know. Henrik Nielsen is a really, if you're really interested in Web API, he writes about it all the time. He is the chief architect on the team, and he is the co-author of the official HTTP specification. So that's a pretty big get. That's pretty much like, I don't know, getting, I don't know, Ted Williams to be a Little League coach, I guess, if he was still alive, right? We did an interview with Brad Wilson. I mentioned that at mashthis.io. And in fact, really, if you're interested in APIs, not only producing but consuming in the API industry, the API business, just go to mashthis.io and take a listen to a couple of the podcasts. They're pretty interesting. And of course, Fiddler, but you already all have that. While I'm up here, I want to take a minute before you thank me to say, 8:03, I just wanted to check myself for time, to say thanks to all of you. I've been coming here since like February, I guess, and I've really gotten so much more out of this than I ever expected. I just really can't say. I've learned so much from every one of you, just talking to you and exchanging ideas and getting to meet you all. This is not the only user group that I've ever been to. I have belonged to several. It's not the only .NET group I've ever belonged to, but it is the best group of any kind that I've belonged to of this type. So definitely, thank you very much. Thanks for letting me do this little thing to try to give back in some way. It's important to me, and I appreciate your time and attention. All right, so that's it. And shoot me an email. I'll send you my resume. Thanks. All right. Okay, so there you go. That's that. Right.
Anybody have any questions?
Yeah. Questions, please. Oh, I thought I was gonna get away scot-free. Dang it.
How do you hypermedia with Web API?
Huh?
Hypermedia. Is it baked in, or is it something you got to do manually?
It's not really baked in, no.
Okay.
No, in fact, that's another thing that we talked to Brad about back a couple of months ago. You know, not really, because you can't, I mean, first of all, the spec is still kind of soft, right? I mean, it hasn't really been fully baked. And the other thing is, there's no real way to return this. You know, I won't say that it can't be done, because somebody, the minute I say that, tomorrow I'll get a blog post or a tweet that somebody did it, right? But you know how we talked about when you do a post, you know, there's certain things that the client expects back. Well, in hypermedia, right? Mm-hmm. It's got to keep track of itself, right?
Right.
Right. It's got to be able to call other methods, and then those methods can call other methods, and those methods can call other methods, and it leaves a breadcrumb. And I don't know of any way that could be done, but I'm not saying that it can't be done. But let's just put it this way: it's not implemented out of the box, you know. It's not just open up new project and there it is. No. A good question, though. Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
With Web API, there's opportunities to do different things. You know,
Right.
before it was MVC. We use MVC as a stack and entity, and you go and you make the page and go blah. Mm-hmm. Web API can go with MVC, and you can do it with the IIS and do the standard stack, and now use this as an intermediary. Or you can use it with straight JavaScript, or you can do it in very different ways. So where do you think this is going? It seems like Microsoft's having all sorts of different things in the web stack. They have a very rich stack, but now they're giving us so many opportunities that we can switch.
Yeah. It's kind of interesting. I had this talk with somebody just the other day, and they said, why not just when I write my next web application, why not just expose all my data to my own application through Web API and just use endpoints like that, right? Kind of like we did with a couple of HTML pages. That's obviously something that you can do. It would obviously be more work. But believe it or not, that's the way a lot of applications are getting written these days. If you go to a site like Programmable Web, right, it lists thousands and thousands and thousands. I think there's like 8,000 public APIs that they list in their directory now. For every public API, there's probably 100 private APIs. Private APIs are by far, vastly by far, where the most API traffic is. Jeff Bezos, back about 10, 15 years ago, came out and said, everything that Amazon does is going to be exposed through an API. And if the accounting department wants to talk to the sales department, it's going to be through an API. And that's it. If sales wants to talk to marketing, if marketing wants to talk to facilities, and as a result of that, Amazon is the biggest API provider pretty much in the world now, because they know what they're doing. If Google had done the same thing back about 5 years ago, they'd be a lot further ahead than they are, in my opinion. Getting back to your question, if I were doing something that I knew was going to need to be exposed to, say, other departments in my company, or exposed to the public, or if I needed to support a native mobile application, for example, it's something that I would definitely implement. The advantage of it is that, and as I showed you, okay, it can run anywhere. You don't need to run it on IIS, and and it does all these other things that you really need to go through or jump through a lot of extra hoops to do with MVC, like the content negotiation. You know, with MVC, you're not going to do content negotiation out of the box. You know, you return an XML string, or you return JSON. You know, but you're not. It's not going to let you read the. I guess you could read the request headers by hand. You know, but yeah. I think it's I think that one of the results will be is that there'll just be a lot more APIs written. You know what I mean? API publication and creation has been something that up to now has been kind of intimidating for people, you know, who maybe don't know HTTP well, or don't know how the web works that much. Or do you remember? Do you remember what web forms did for web development? This might do for API development, except with a lot less abstractions, you know, and a lot more straightforward and lightweight, and I think. So anyway, anybody else? No? Yes, no? I did want to mention one thing real quick too. When I showed you HttpClient, of course I showed you hitting the API that we had built there, right? The contact manager, but this is something you should realize, that all it does is it issues requests and then reads the results, right? So you don't need to be hitting only your own API. You don't need to be hitting only other ASP.NET Web APIs. You can use HttpClient with any API that you have access to. You know, you can send authorization headers, so you can authorize if you have, like, say, a developer key, and you need it to, in fact, I used it just last week to, has anybody here ever heard of Stripe, which is a payment service? Yeah. Have you used it? Yeah, real good, real good. And I used HttpClient to access it. So they have a little JS library too, but yeah. So I mean, it doesn't matter if it can understand requests, you can use client. So yeah, that's it. That's that, I guess. And I'll just okay, cool. Thanks, folks. Appreciate it. All right, yeah.
This one.